Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Law, Politics, and Society. I am excited to take you through Chapter 9 this week. We're going to be looking at law and social control. Before we do that, we're going to talk a little bit about one of your discussion questions for last week, and then we'll get started. So I want to make really clear what happened in McDonald v. Chicago, as there was some confusion. So this was a 5-4 Supreme Court decision that ultimately incorporated under the 14th Amendment the rights and privileges guaranteed in the Second Amendment. So this has had the effect of incorporating the Second Amendment to make it apply to the states and local governments, which makes gun laws much harder to pass and therefore much more strongly protects the rights of gun owners. And so this builds off of the DC v. Heller decision, which happened 2 years previously, but this case goes much farther. In DC v. Heller, the courts essentially said that the gun ownership rights didn't just apply to citizens wanting to join a militia, but they applied to individuals for home protection, and that individuals didn't need to justify their desire to purchase a gun. In this case, the court's saying that laws that are passed by the states and local governments must meet the very high standard passed and enacted in the Second Amendment. And as you remember, the Second Amendment clearly states that the right to bear arms must not be infringed. And so it's going to be really interesting to tease out whether or not any gun laws will be allowed to stand and whether they'll pass constitutional muster or not. So this does give gun owners a lot more freedom from regulation that they might have otherwise expected to encounter. So this week we're looking at social control and the idea of societies being controlled through law and legal systems. And so before we talk about that, we need to get some definitions out of the way. So one of the first things, what is social control? Well, it's an action, either deliberate or unconscious, that influences our conduct towards conforming with society's expectations, whether or not the persons that are being influenced are aware of that process. So we subconsciously influence each other all the time to make sure that we fulfill our own social obligations. There's often some sort of coercive societal pressure not to break laws, even if there's no one around to catch us. So an example I often use about this is a red light. Let's say you see a red light and you're in the middle of nowhere. It's a clear sunny day and you can see for a mile in either direction. Do you still stop at that red light? And if you do, there might be a number of reasons why, right? Maybe you're afraid that there's a camera on the stoplight pole and you're going to get a ticket. Or maybe there's a cop sitting just past a mile that you can't see. Or maybe you're just so used to stopping at stop signs and stopping at stop lights that you stop out of habit. And that's a system of social control. It restricts you and regulates you and puts checks on your behavior. So control is any restriction and supervision or regulation that exercises restraint. Right? So a red light is a form of social control, right? We have it as a mechanism to ensure safety and security, but I'll be curious if some of you would perhaps run that red light if you could see for a mile in either direction. And if you would, why would you run it? We often jaywalk all the time. Anytime I'm down in Madison, I see people walking left and right all over the place, no regard for the rules, right? Because there's a rule against jaywalking. There's a bylaw. Why do we so flippantly toss that rule out the window? Typically convenience and the very low stakes, right? We're not afraid of somebody giving us a ticket or arresting us and putting us in jail for jaywalking to the social sciences building. But I'll start a little discussion on this and I'll be curious to see how you respond. So social control is necessary to make sure that we behave in a manner that it helps us coexist with law. So the primary function of law then is to make sure that we follow the rules, that there are limits to our behavior. It's necessary to make sure that there's a peaceful coexistence, right? We don't go around murdering people. We don't beat people up. We don't engage in theft and take other people's property because social control sets limits on our behavior. And you can think of this as sort of an exchange between the government and individual citizens. I, as an individual citizen, give up some of my rights and freedoms to be able to murder people or beat people up or take other people's property in exchange for the government not letting other people beat me up or take my property. And so it gives us this predictable coexistence, this peaceful coexistence, whereby we know what to expect from each other, we know what to expect from our governments, and it allows us more individual security. So there are different types of social control, direct and indirect, and formal versus informal. And so your text has a grid in chapter 9 that has a really good example of the different typologies. But we're going to go through each and talk a little bit about the role of each of the forms of social control. And so the first is the direct form of social control. And this is that coercive state pressure that is felt in, for example, the presence of a police officer or that red light that we were talking about earlier. People don't want to engage in behaviors that they know will get them punished. And so a direct form of social control exists when we know that there's somebody who's able to judge us on the rightness or wrongness of that behavior and has the power of the state behind them. But indirect social control is more informal. It is persuasive and voluntary and often better than direct control because we internalize the rules. We have self-regulating thermostats like consciences that tell us, yeah, I think I can see in a mile in either direction, but what if I'm wrong? What if there's something I don't see? Oh, I don't want to hurt anybody. I'll just wait, right? Even if we're impatient or even if we have places to go, we're going to sit and wait. Even if we're not thinking that there's a camera or that someone's going to catch us, we don't want to do other people harm. So we choose to sit and wait. And this can be much better than direct control because it's not only obeying for the sake of obeying, for punishment's sake. It's obeying because we believe the law has validity and that we don't want to do harm to other people. But oftentimes the two are not mutually exclusive. So you might stop at that red light partially because you don't want to get a ticket, right? You don't want to pay the money, but partially because you also don't want to do harm. Or, there might be somebody else in the car with you that you really want to go. You don't think there's going to be, a sanction, but somebody else keeps you responsible, keeps you accountable. And so you choose not to run the red light. And so you can have both forces pulling on you at the same time, and often they can help reinforce each other. So one of the people who has written a lot about the phenomenon of social control is a man by the name of Donald Black, who's a famous legal sociologist, who talked about the roles and the relationship between direct and indirect social control, but as well as formal and informal social control. And so Black believed that as informal social controls weaken, there's an increased reliance on formal legal controls. So formal legal controls are going to be those police officers, those red light cameras, those state mechanisms of ensuring compliance. But the informal social controls are things like our friends and our teachers, our peer groups, our family, our people that we spend a lot of time with, but even the broader sense of our acquaintances and our community members. And so according to Black, when those social controls weaken, those informal ones, the family, we don't have a strong social bonds, we're not tied to our community the same way, we will rely increasingly on formal measures. Because if you are at that stoplight and you're not concerned about who you hurt, right? You don't care about your members of your community, you're not invested in your community, you're going to be more likely to run that light. And so you need the pressure of the state to ensure that you don't. So there's an inverse relationship there. If you have strong informal controls, you don't need as strong formal ones, and vice versa. And so Black said that law was a measure of the success or failure of other forms of social control, right? If you have a lot of formal legal measures, it means that your informal structures are probably not as strong as they need to be. And when the crime rate is going up, it also indicates that your informal social controls are low. You don't have enough community social regulation to ensure those informal social controls are exerting the right type of pressure. And so he created the two dichotomies, the formal and informal, direct and indirect. It's on page 227 of your textbook. And it shows you the ways that you can apply the direct and formal, direct and informal, formal and indirect, informal, indirect, right? So there's 4 separate boxes there. And he talks about the ways in which it can be applied to moral violations that were also illegal. So in your text, they talk about engaging in sex outside of marriage, adultery. This was a serious offense in the early Massachusetts Bay Colony. And in fact, adultery is still a criminal offense in the military, where you can be court-martialed. So it's interesting to see the different social norms. But I would encourage you to think about the typology there as it applies to our situation, running the red light, and why you might not run the red light, and see if you can fill in those boxes. So one of the things that helps with social control is punishment, because people often obey the law out of fear. Fear of getting caught and fear of what will happen when they get caught. So informally, when people violate rules of acceptable behavior, they often feel guilty, right? So if you talked over somebody at a meeting, or were rude and interrupted a colleague, or haven't been displaying your best manners, you might feel guilty. You might feel a little bit of shame. And this is typically in proportion to the level of disapproval attached to the rules that you were violating. There's a correlation there. You're not going to feel immense amounts of guilt and shame for a really small transgression, but you might for a bigger transgression. But what the law says is that these internal restraints, these mechanisms of guilt or shame or embarrassment, aren't always enough. There will be some people who don't feel that way, and you need to enact a formal mechanism to codify those internal rules. There needs to be a tangible bad experience, and that's punishment, right? So for most people, the shame, the guilt would be enough. Some people it's not, and we need to rise to that level of punishment. So punishment is a phenomenon where we as a society express our disapproval. It's a form of social condemnation where we say, you, person who engaged in bad behavior, shouldn't do that thing, running a red light. And as a society, we're going to fine you $300, to make sure you don't do it again, which is a form of deterrence, right? We want to deter you from doing it again. But B, to show you that we are cracking down on this behavior. We want to stop this behavior. And so there are 2 types of deterrence. The first that I used in that example is called specific deterrence, right? I want to deter you, person A, from running red lights. And so I am going to fine you in the hopes that you, person A, stop running red lights. But there's also a form of what's called general deterrence, where I punish you in hopes that I send a message to the community that running red lights is not going to be tolerated, and that running red lights incurs a $300 fine. And I, as person B, don't want a $300 fine, so I better make sure I don't run any red lights. Right? There are some legal theorists that say it's not about social control. It's not about how formal your punishment structure is, that it's our moral conscience that's going to keep us from committing crime. And that's probably true for some people. For some people, it doesn't matter whether or not you're going to get caught or if there's a punishment, they're not going to jaywalk, right? They're going to abide by the letter of the law. They're going to wait for the sign. They're going to stay at the crosswalk. And there are other people like me, I admit, in this circumstance, who's impatient and who doesn't want to wait for the light. And if I don't think that there's a car coming, I don't see any jeopardy, I go, right? Because I'm impatient and I'm, not attached enough, I suppose, to that formal control mechanism, the anti-jaywalking prohibitions. And so, yes, for some things, I think our moral conscience is strong enough, likely. But for other things, we need a little state pressure. One of the things that your text talks about is how we measure the failure of informal social control. And they say you can roughly measure the failure of informal social control by comparing the number of lawyers in the United States to those of other countries. And we know that the US admits vastly more lawyers to the bar every year, significantly more, 50,000 in the US in 1 year, approximately, where we have one lawyer for about every 350 people. Whereas in the United Kingdom, it's less than a third of that. There's one lawyer for every 1,200 people. And in Japan, one for every 9,000 people. So that means that we have a significantly stricter legal, formal, direct social control mechanism, which means that our social bonds, our social cohesion is less than countries like the UK and Japan, where you're having significantly less norm violations, rule violations. You're not relying on formal state control to the same degree. So one of the things that is interesting to measure is the different philosophies of punishment, right? What is the role of punishment? What's the purpose of punishment? Obviously, punishment is always going to be painful, not necessarily to the body, but perhaps to the mind or to the pocketbook. So it's going to be something that is not enjoyable. But why do we punish? Well, there are a few different theories. The first justification for punishment, why we punish, is retribution. So this is the eye for the eye concept, that when somebody commits a crime, you should engage in punishment as a state form of revenge, right? We don't allow citizens to engage in vigilantism or to get their own revenge, so the state does it for them, right? It's regulated, but it's essentially revenge. And this falls under what's called the just desserts model, the idea that people should get what they deserve, that there's no secondary purpose for punishing other than, to engage them from engage them from further committing crime, right? That would be to deter them. But sometimes state legislatures say the only purpose is imprisonment, is punishment. We're not doing it for any other reason other than to punish. That's a retributive model. That's saying that people should get what they deserve. If they commit a crime, what they deserve is punishment, so that's what they'll get. But there are other philosophies. Incapacitation, we punish to incapacitate, is this idea that wicked people exist and they need to be set apart from innocent people so that they can't do any more damage, so that they can't create any more harm. Right? There are bad people. We don't like bad people. We should put them over there. And over there should be far away from the rest of us, right? Us good people. And because when individuals are incapacitated or, they're under state control, they can't victimize other people. So, for example, in incarceration facilities, criminals can't victimize other people outside of prison walls, right? They may be able to engage in violent activities within prison, but the rest of us, society members, are going to be safe from them. So the incapacitation model really does set out a sort of us versus them mentality, right? We, the good people over here, and they, the bad people over there, who need to be temporarily removed from society for as long as the state deems necessary. So there are two other philosophies of why we punish that are worth talking about and are important. The first is rehabilitation. And so the idea behind rehabilitation is that we punish people to fix their faulty thinking or bad wiring. So rehabilitation is based on a medical model that says that criminal behavior is inherently a product of some medical issues, whether those are physiological or psychological or primarily emotional, that we can fix the things that led to criminal behavior. So we can have anger management classes. We can use cognitive behavioral therapy to increase awareness of consequences and what actions precipitate what consequences. We can restore individuals to healthy and constructive living. And we've seen a lot of success with the rehabilitation model in what are called drug courts. And so these are courts that are specialized for individuals with addictions who have been committing criminal activities, engaging in criminal activities as a result primarily of their addictions, whether that's stealing or writing bad checks or engaging in prostitution. The states have realized that really the addictions issue is what's causing the other issues. And if we can get the addiction issue under control, we can eradicate the other criminality. So the rehabilitation model focuses first on what's at the root of this problem. And once we address that, then the criminality will go away. But often it uses elements of incapacitation temporarily as well, or it can. And it has some forms of reintegration as well. And reintegration is the idea that we can use the time that the offenders are under state supervision to prepare them to reenter their communities as better citizens and well-equipped to handle their new lives. One of the things that we know about individuals who have been incarcerated is that often they return to the same neighborhoods that they left with no difference in skills, right? If we've been warehousing people and incapacitating them, putting them far away, they're going to go back to the same neighborhoods when they get released and nothing will have changed. They won't have any more money, they won't have any more job skills, they won't have a better resume. In fact, it'll be worse, right? They'll have to declare that they've been incarcerated, that they do have a criminal record, they'll be less likely to get jobs. So we're creating more of an economic problem, perhaps, by incapacitating. And so reintegration says we need to give people skills during this time. They can get their GED, they can get some college classes, they can take anger management classes, they can learn how to write a resume, they can maybe work in a workshop or work in the kitchens or do something that will allow them to have some skills so that when they get out, they will be better community members. And so you can see the value in some of these models. Not all of them will work for every circumstance, but that's the nice thing about them is that you can tailor these models, you can tailor punishment so that it is appropriate when circumstances warrant, like using addictions courts for primary drug issues, for example. Okay, so what does social control mean for the criminal justice system? Well, the criminal justice system is the mechanism that we have set up for enforcing legal social control. And there are different views on how it should work, whether or not it does work, and what its goal should be going forward. Right now, conservatives and liberals agree that the criminal justice system does not enforce social control well. But typically for different reasons. Often conservatives believe that the system is too soft on crime. We're not punishing criminals more severely enough, and that the system we have is a waste of taxpayer dollars. It's too expensive, and it doesn't do a good enough job. Liberals agree that it's too expensive and it doesn't do a good enough job. But their argument is that it doesn't do a good enough job because it doesn't focus enough on rehabilitation. And so there's oftentimes we have these two groups talking past each other, where some will say we need stronger sentences, and then some will say, well, no, we don't need stronger sentences. We need more things for people to do within that sentence. We need to focus on rehabilitation. No, we need to be more punitive. We need to be harder. No, we need to be more focused on medical models. So often you get these groups talking past each other. But there was something amazing that happened in December of last year. There was an act of rare bipartisanship on Capitol Hill, and both the House and Senate, and then President Trump signed the First Step Act. So I had to read a little bit about the First Step Act. And this is going to remedy some of the old injustices in the criminal justice system, where we punished different types of drugs differently, largely based on race. So for example, crack and powder cocaine were punished very differently. Powder cocaine was typically seen as a white drug of the upper middle class, whereas crack cocaine was seen as an inner city drug of the urban, typically within the inner cities. And so powder cocaine, you had to have 500 grams to get a sentence of 5 years, mandatory minimum of 5 years, whereas crack cocaine, you needed 5 grams. So you have a 100-to-1 sentencing disparity in how we were punishing the same drug. It's different, one you snort, one you smoke. Other than that, they're the same drug. And to have that level of sentencing disparity really targeted primarily people of color and inner city individuals. And this started in the late 1970s and destroyed families, communities, neighborhoods, and put people in prison for long periods of time without any likelihood that they would get out, and for nonviolent offenses. And so the First Step Act is remedying that. It's focusing more on rehabilitation, but it's also focusing on nonviolent offenders. We're not changing how we treat violent offenders, but we're saying that we should change our approach to how we treat nonviolent offenders. So the perception that the United States is soft on crime has been one that has been pervasive since the Civil Rights Movement and the early 1960s. But really, this is a bit of a misnomer. Only Russia in the Western world comes close to touching the US rate of incarceration, but the closest modern Western nation is the United Kingdom, and their rate of incarceration is 4 times lower than that of the United States. And so this is the updated graph of the one in your text. Your text is from 2005. And I thought this showed very drastically that compared to other democracies, the United States is actually really hard on crime. The United States incarcerates more people than just about anywhere else in the world. The US is also one of the only countries that still has the death penalty. And so the perception that the United States is somehow soft on crime or tolerant of crime is really not true. In fact, the US is likely more hard on crime than just about anywhere else. And so this is one of the things that I think refutes the notion in your text that the US is more of a due process country. I think the US is much closer to the middle because while we have a strong Bill of Rights and strong protections for individual rights and liberties, we are also not afraid to use the sword of justice and the process that is the criminal justice system when we feel that there has been a wrong that has occurred in the legal sphere. And so I think this graph really shows that certainly proportionally, we are not soft on crime. One of the things that increases the number of people incarcerated is the phenomenon known as plea bargaining. So plea bargaining is the mechanism where you can plead guilty to whatever crimes you're alleged to have committed in exchange for a reduced punishment or a lesser sentence or some options, such as I'll plead guilty, but I want to serve my sentence closer to my family, or I'll plead guilty if you knock off some of the charges, or I'll plead guilty if you give me a certain sentencing range. And about 90% of all felony suspects plead guilty, which has some downsides. For conservatives, the downsides are that people get leniency that they maybe didn't deserve. If they went to trial and were found guilty, they would get much harsher sentences. For liberals, there's the fear that coercing suspects to plead guilty, telling them, if you don't plead guilty, we're going to convict you and you're going to spend the rest of your life in prison, really encourages people to surrender their Fifth and Sixth Amendment rights. Right? You remember from last week, you have the right to remain silent. You have a right to a jury of your peers, an impartial trial. But there are many reasons why people take plea bargains. Often they can't afford their bail, so they're already incarcerated, waiting for trial, and they can't wait 2 years for a trial to then, even if they're found not guilty, to have that interruption. They need to get back to their families. It's not worth it for them to stay and fight to maintain their innocence while they're incarcerated. For others, maybe they did do the crime, and so they're willing to take a reduced sentence, or that they're afraid of what the prosecutors will accuse them of at trial, even if they're not guilty. We do know that there have been numerous instances where people have engaged in false confessions. They've admitted to things that they did not do out of fear. And so this is something that is a concern. And plea bargaining really is part of that assembly line model of the crime control system of justice. Prosecutors are overwhelmed with caseloads in the United States. There are too many cases. There's not enough time to take them all to trial. There are huge trial backlogs, particularly for felony cases. It takes a really long time to get them to trial. And so the plea bargain helps that assembly line keep moving. Okay, so you did this, yep, okay, sign here, 30 days, next. You did this, okay, yep, fine is this, move on, next, right? And so it keeps that assembly line model going, but you forfeit a lot of your rights if you take a plea bargain. You're not allowed to appeal. Typically, that will be a right that you surrender. You don't get a trial, you don't get a jury. There are a lot of things that you give up if you take a plea bargain. And there are often some incentives that the prosecutor will put on. And this has been upheld in Bordenkircher v. Hayes in 1978, that there can be some fairly dire consequences, and prosecutors can use that leverage and threaten defendants with these dire consequences if they don't want to bargain. So in Bordenkircher, what we had was a case where an individual had been accused of committing a forgery, which was a 10-year penalty in Kentucky where he had committed this forgery. And the prosecutor offered 5 years, and he said no. Hayes said no. He said, I'm not taking 5 years. I didn't do it. And then you have the state saying, well, if you don't plead guilty and take the 5 years, I'm going to add some more charges on, and then you will be deemed to be a habitual offender, and you'd be looking at a life sentence. And so this is what's called charge stacking, where you add multiple charges to really convince people that they're facing very serious jeopardy and induce them to take a plea bargain. And this was deemed to be constitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court, saying that Hayes was free to accept or reject the offer, so he wasn't in grave jeopardy. But now it's a tool that prosecutors use to take pleas, which some say coerce defendants into taking deals, even if they didn't do the offense, because they're so afraid of the jeopardy that they're facing. One of the reasons that plea bargaining is more common in the US than in some other countries is because of the existence of the death penalty. So many plea bargains in the US involve life sentences in exchange for the death penalty being taken off the table. And because the US is one of few states that allow the death penalty, this exacerbates rates. So the death penalty and its use in the United States has been subject to very intense debate beginning in the 1960s and starting intense Supreme Court debates in the late 1970s. It does remain highly popular in the US today. It's been retained by 30 states as well as the federal government. Washington state was the most recent abolishment of the death penalty last year. But approximately 60% of Americans still favor the death penalty, although the support waxes and wanes up and down with the crime rate. So when the crime rate is really low, support for the death penalty goes down. When the crime rate is really high, support for the death penalty rises. So we have seen some states abolish the death penalty by referendum, but typically it's done by the legislature. And the conversation around whether or not we should have the death penalty typically revolves around the Eighth Amendment. So you'll remember from last week, the Eighth Amendment prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. And so many scholars and legal jurists have argued that the death penalty is inherently cruel and unusual, and thus should be prohibited. And that was the initial argument in 1972 in Furman v. Georgia. And the Supreme Court disagreed with that argument. They said the death penalty per se was not unconstitutional. It was the way that it was being carried out. And so at the time in Georgia, the death penalty was largely arbitrary and discriminatory. They argued that the sentencing process was unconstitutional because individuals would be sentenced found guilty and then sentenced in the same day, by the same jury at the same time, and that it was completely random as to what jury you got. There were no specific factors that had to be considered, and they said that this was arbitrary and discriminatory. So they banned the death penalty in 1972. So the death penalty was only banned for 4 years because Georgia once again brought the case to the Supreme Court in 1976, arguing that because they had changed their sentencing procedures and introduced what are called bifurcated sentencing, or two-step sentencing, having a trial to determine guilt first, and then a second mini-trial to impose sentencing, that these changes should be enough to make the death penalty constitutional. And the Supreme Court agreed. They said, yes, this is no longer arbitrary, it's no longer discriminatory, so good job, Georgia, you fixed the problem, the death penalty is no longer unconstitutional. So we have a few cases after that changed the death penalty and the landscape. One interesting one was Coker v. Georgia in 1977, the next year, that struck down the use of the death penalty for rape cases. They said you can't use the death penalty for rape. And so the states have continued to put limits on the use of the death penalty. In Atkins v. Virginia in 2002, they said that the execution of any person who is intellectually disabled is unconstitutional. It violates the cruel and unusual punishment statute and part of the Constitution. 3 years later, in Roper v. Simmons, they said the same thing about the execution of individuals that were under the age of 18 at the time the offense was committed. So the execution of child offenders was also deemed unconstitutional. But in Bays and Bowling v. Reese in 2008, they ruled that the mechanism of execution, in this case lethal injection, was not cruel and unusual and did not constitute a violation of the Eighth Amendment. So there had been an argument that the lethal injection constituted undue suffering, and for a while, actually, there was a prohibition on executions until the Supreme Court made a decision. But the Supreme Court said no, using lethal injection to execute individuals is not cruel and unusual. And that's sort of where we are in the death penalty debate. The map that I've included here, the green states do not allow the death penalty. The red states do allow the death penalty. So you can see Wisconsin does not. It has not allowed the death penalty since the 1850s. It was one of the first states to abolish the death penalty. And you can see most of the northeastern states do not have the death penalty. Although there are some states that theoretically have the death penalty, but have not executed anybody in tens of years, in decades. So there are some states that retain it but don't use it. There are other states like Texas and Oklahoma that use the death penalty fairly regularly. So it just depends on the type of crime. The federal government also has the death penalty, and it has used it in terrorism cases. Most famously, it executed Timothy McVeigh for the Oklahoma City bombings, which killed more than 180 people in Oklahoma City. So even though the majority of states have the death penalty on the books, the vast majority of them do not use it, and the death penalty is rarely carried out in the United States today. In 2014, there were 35 people that were executed using the death penalty. Of those, 43% were white, 42% were black, 13% were Hispanic, 2% identified as other, and of the 35, only 1.6 were women. So very few women are ever executed. It's very, very rare for a female death row inmate to be executed. You will see that as of 2014, there were more than 3,000 inmates still on death row. And if we're only doing 35 a year or less, in 2015 we only did 10, we're not executing all of the people that are on death row. And one of the reasons for that is the appeal system. This is where that due process system comes in. For individuals sentenced to death, there are a number of what are called as of right appeals, which means that you have direct appeals to your state Supreme Court and all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States without having to prove there was a mistake in your trial. So you get extra appeals if you are sentenced to death, because obviously this is something that the government does not take lightly. It does not want to execute innocent individuals, so there are more safety mechanisms and more stopgap measures. But in 2014, the US was the only Western democracy to use the death penalty at all. And this has been true since 2014. It's been the only country that uses the death penalty. And so there have been a lot of criticisms that have begun to get raised about the death penalty and its use. We're going to talk about those on the next slide. So there are numerous arguments both for and against the death penalty. We're going to start with against, because that's how your textbook goes, but we will talk about the arguments for it as well. So the first argument against the death penalty is that it shows a lack of respect for human life. So one of the things that we prohibit in the criminal code is murder, right? We say that killing of another person, unless it's in self-defense, is illegal. And so there are many that argue that because this is a sanctity that has been enshrined in moral codes all the way back to Hammurabi, the governments should also not be in the business of killing people, that it is barbaric, that the countries that use it are not Western democracies. The countries that use it are typically either totalitarian regimes or authoritarian regimes that are not democratic, and that we should not associate ourselves with those countries. In addition, there's no evidence that it serves as a deterrent. Many people that are in favor of capital punishment will say that, well, if people know that they're going to be sentenced to death, then they're not going to commit crimes. It'll be a deterrent, so there'll be less crime. But it's just not true. There's no evidence that it serves as a deterrent. States that have the death penalty frequently have higher crime rates. It's not working. Often, individuals who are committing crimes are not thinking about what the punishment is going to be. They're not necessarily making those rational decisions, and they don't think they're going to get caught. So it's not working as a deterrent the way that individuals often had hoped. One of the real phenomenons against the death penalty in the arguments is called the brutalization effect. Now, we don't have the evidence of this in the United States that we would like to have. But this was an effect that was originally posited by Cesar Beccaria in the 1700s. And the argument was that not only is capital punishment not a deterrent, that it might cause rises in homicides because of this brutalization effect. So the argument is that there is a contradictory message that says you cannot kill except the state. The state can kill. So then killing is not actually wrong. That there's no moral issue with killing because the state is in the business of killing people, which can have influences on fringe killers or individuals that believe that there is someone out there who's committed a wrong against them. So it may encourage vigilante killing or killing as a mechanism of revenge. It has been used, the brutalization effect was demonstrated much more commonly and more thoroughly in England in the 19th century. We don't have the same type of evidence for it in the United States. It is more costly than life sentences. Many people think the death penalty would be cheaper, but it's not actually because of all of the appeals. Because you're entitled to counsel for all of your death penalty appeals. The government is footing the bill for your defense attorney all the way up to the Supreme Court if necessary. It also requires you be held in solitary confinement on death row. And those penitentiaries are more expensive to construct. They're more expensive to maintain and to supervise. And so there are a lot more public safety concerns surrounding death penalty individuals who are sentenced to death. So they end up being much more expensive. And the final argument that we often talk about is the possibility of executing the innocent. So we talked 2 weeks ago about would you rather have one man be punished or would you rather have innocent man be punished or 10 guilty men escape or go free? And this is where that rubber meets the road, where it doesn't become a hypothetical anymore, it becomes a factual argument. What if we get it wrong? We know that we have executed innocent people throughout the history of the United States. It's not hypothetical, it's factual. We've done it. So where does that possibility stop? What should we do about that? Advocates of abolishing the death penalty say if you don't kill anybody, then we won't kill the wrong people. Then we won't kill innocent people. Proponents of the death penalty say, well, we're getting better at not killing innocent people with the rise of DNA and technology and the new materials that we have. So perhaps we don't have to worry about this as much. And that might be true, but there's still that tension, right? Where are you willing to draw the line in the likelihood that somebody might be innocent and accidentally executed? So for individuals that favor the death penalty, they bring back the deterrence argument, and most of them accept that there's no evidence that the death penalty is a deterrent. But they say that if we use the death penalty more frequently and properly, it would be. So if people actually thought that they would be punished to death, if we executed people more regularly and more frequently, it would be a deterrent. People would stop committing those crimes. Now, we don't have the evidence for this because the countries that have the death penalty don't necessarily see a deterrent effect even when they use it fairly regularly, but it is hypothetically possible. So that is one argument that favors the death penalty. There's also the cost-benefit assessment and the idea that individuals who are committing crimes will engage in rational cost-benefit assessments to determine whether or not they want to commit the crime enough to be willing to sacrifice their own life. So you would have to hope that the criminals are rational and that they would assess their crime as not being worth dying themselves, and then hopefully they would not commit those crimes. The individuals who favor the death penalty also say the only reason it's costly, the only reason it's so expensive is because of the appeals process. This isn't true entirely because there are some incarceration issues that also make it more expensive, but absolutely it is mostly more expensive because of the appeals process. And so proponents of the death penalty point to the decision in Coleman versus Thompson in 1991, which is a Supreme Court decision that put some limits on death penalty appeals. The problem is that those limits really haven't changed how expensive it is. There are still a large number of appeals that are able to be filed, and it's still significantly more than what you would be entitled to with a life sentence. Some other arguments that we hear from individuals who support the death penalty is that just because the United States uses it, it doesn't put us on the same moral plane as China or Iran or North Korea. That they're not the acts might be physically equivalent, but they're not morally equivalent. We're not doing executions without trials. We're not doing them at the behest of authoritarian dictators. We're doing it in a manner that is much more civilized. It represents societal opinion. It is recommended by a jury. And so it is much more legitimate than in countries where it's exercised by totalitarianisms. Other arguments that favor the death penalty. We know that frequently that we execute more people of color than people of color exist as a proportion of the general population. This is just true of incarceration more broadly. We incarcerate more Black Americans and Latino and Latina Americans than we do than they are a percentage of the population. It's a phenomenon known as overrepresentation. And so that exists at every level of the criminal justice system. But proponents of the death penalty say that this is not a reflection of racial bias. We're not executing people purely because they're Black or because they're Hispanic. And this was codified in McCluskey v. Kemp in 1987. The Supreme Court said that just because statistical aggregations say that there are overrepresentations doesn't mean that the individual sentences were not just. So just because we appear to be executing more Black people than there as a percentage of the executions than they are a percentage of the population doesn't mean those individuals weren't guilty or that their sentences were somehow a reflection of racial bias. And again, there's that argument that it's less likely now that we'll execute innocent individuals than in the past. Our science has gotten better, our technology has gotten better. We have more rules surrounding false confessions and eyewitness identification so that we're less likely to get it wrong. And so those are the arguments that states have to weigh when they decide whether or not they're going to change their policies, that individuals have to weigh in referendums when they get to vote on whether or not they want to keep the death penalty. And so I'm curious to know what you think, and this will be a question that I will pose to you this week in discussion. One of the things that governments do when considering the mechanisms of social control is to try and suppress political dissent. They want to minimize political dissent almost more than they want to minimize crime, because political dissent is very dangerous to the fabric of society. We certainly don't, or at least the government doesn't want revolution, right? There's no desire for an overthrow of the system within the system that is seen as very dangerous. And so there are mechanisms that governments use to try and control dissent. And in the United States, those mechanisms can include passing laws to prohibit certain behaviors, things like prohibiting election laws, making it more difficult for certain groups to participate, or making it more difficult for certain candidates to appear on the ballot. We can do this through harassment and intimidation. We can do it through force. We can suppress uprisings through force. And we can do this through attempts to change public opinion. And so two examples I want to talk about briefly are the Espionage Act and the Patriot Act. So the Espionage Act of 1917 was passed during World War I. And it very broadly defined the term espionage. It made it very easy to convict individuals of espionage because it used the term seditious material. So sedition is to go against the government. And so material that went against the government was considered espionage. So this was very, very, very broad. It made it illegal essentially to express opposition to the war. And you might say, this is unreasonable because we have free speech protections and we have all of these things we talked about last week. Yeah, the great majority of the American population, however, supported these acts as legitimate. They believed that anybody who criticized the war was treasonous. They were not, rising up to say, "Hey, government, stop stealing my free speech protections." And so nobody challenged the espionage laws. Now they were eventually repealed after the war, but it's something to be aware of in terms of the power that governments can exercise. Another example of this, obviously, is the Patriot Act. This passed exactly 1 month after the attacks of September 11th, 2001, and they were passed directly in response to those terrorist attacks. And so this allows the federal government to track and intercept private communications, U.S. nationals as well as internationals. Its goal was to prevent money laundering, prevent corruption, create new punishments for new crimes, created new crimes, because previously we hadn't had these broad statutes of terrorism-related crimes, but there were many more crimes that were created after 9/11. And this was not controversial initially when it passed. People thought, if I'm not doing anything wrong, then it doesn't matter. The people that are doing things wrong, they'll get punished, and that's fine. But the longer the Patriot Act has been around, it's been more than 18 years now, people started to realize there were some overreaches. The government was collecting huge amounts of data on individual citizens without their consent or permission, that arguably violated the Fourth Amendment and the protections against illegal search and seizure. This is what Edward Snowden came forward and disclosed and said, look, this is what the government is doing. We should have a conversation about whether or not we think this is right or not. He subsequently fled to Russia out of fear that he would be arrested, and he certainly would have been. And so there are tensions here between what rights citizens have under the First Amendment, under the Fourth Amendment, to criticize their governments, to be free from government intrusion, and what rights the government has in order to prevent either mass terrorist casualties and terrorist attacks, or to prevent revolutions and uprisings. Okay, so we know that the law exists as a mechanism of social control, and one of the ways that that manifests is through criminal justice. But one of the other ways that social control can exist is through psychiatry, and this is through sort of a medicalization model. So psychiatric hospitals are among institutions that are devoted to social control. They continue to posit and reflect the norms of society, and they limit unacceptable behaviors or behaviors that are seen to be potentially dangerous or threatening. And so this dates back to a doctrine all the way back in history called parens patriae, which is the mechanism for which the government can take control of individuals and become their de facto parent. They can make decisions on what's in their best interest. And this was initially used for juveniles, where it was found that the juveniles' parents might not have been acting in their best interest. And so the state could take over and make decisions in the best interest of the child. And this is true for individuals with mental health issues as well. There is some controversy about the medicalization of deviance, what constitutes a mental illness versus a mental abnormality, which of these requires institutionalization, if any. And there were large discrepancies between how, for example, the Soviet Union practiced medicalizing and institutionalizing individuals with mental illness versus how the United States has historically medicalized and institutionalized individuals with mental illness. But one of the ways in which we employ this is for individuals who are found not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect. So this is a process in the criminal justice system where individuals, although they committed the crime, they did not have the requisite consciousness or mental capacity to understand what they were doing. And thus they are found not guilty by mental disease or defect, or sometimes called not guilty by reason of insanity. And in those cases, individuals, instead of being incarcerated, are incapacitated in mental health units for indeterminate periods of time. So they can be held even longer than their previous incarceration sentence would have been in prison to ensure that they are not a danger to themselves or to society. An example of this, not guilty by reason of insanity or mental disease or defect in Wisconsin, was the recent Slender Man killings or attempted killing of a young girl, Peyton, by her best friends who were 12 at the time. And this was referred to as the Slender Man case because you had two individuals who believed that they were going to sacrifice their friend to the not real, this fictional character, this deity called Slender Man, who they believed was real, and they'd convinced themselves were real. And this is why they had stabbed their friend Peyton numerous times. And they were both found not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect, and it looks like they will spend at least 40 years in a mental health institution. Another way that we use the medicalization of individuals is typically for sex offenders. So in Kansas v. Hendricks in 1997, we have a Supreme Court case that upholds the Kansas statute aimed at civilly committing sex offenders, which means that we can keep them incarcerated after their prison term has ended if we can demonstrate that they either have a personality disorder or a severe mental abnormality that cause them to be at great risk to children. And so the Supreme Court allowed for the continued incapacitation of individuals who pose risk, and they can be punished essentially indefinitely. And so this was controversial at the time because it seemed to be violating individuals' due process rights and their rights to be released once they had been once they'd served their full sentence. But the civil commitment laws were upheld as legitimate because of the fear that the mental abnormality or mental defect would cause these individuals to reoffend. And there was some literature, some scholarly literature that helped to support the idea that many individuals who have committed sex offenses, particularly against children, will be at a very high likelihood to do so again. And so this is one of the mechanisms that we've used as a form of social control. So what about social control that's not exercised by the legislative branch, but instead is exercised by the judiciary? Well, most people in the United States feel like judicial social control is a legitimate use of power because it's used to enforce rules that are already legitimate. So they're enforcing laws that have been set out by Congress, and so that use of judicial power is often uncontroversial. But there have been cases where it has been seen that judges are overstepping their boundaries. And a good example of this is the Missouri v. Jenkins case in 1990. So in Jenkins case, what had happened was there had been a large number of students, particularly white students, who had fled to the suburbs to avoid having to go to school with inner city youth. And this created this phenomenon of whites fleeing to the suburbs is known as white flight. And the government was trying to respond to that phenomenon. And so in Kansas City, the school district had essentially been operating a segregated school. You had primarily minority students in the inner cities and primarily white students in the suburbs. And so Judge Clark ruled that you could create a property tax in order to raise the funds to have what was called a magnet school. This would bring back white suburban students to the inner cities and integrate both cities. The lawyers were furious. Lawyers for Missouri were furious about this. They said that the law violated the Due Process Clause of the Constitution. But the Supreme Court agreed with Judge Clark, largely because they said we have to follow the precedent that was set in Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, which required the schools be integrated, that you could not have segregated schools. And this upset greatly the school districts, white suburban parents who had moved out of the inner cities, partially because they thought that they would be able to go to better schools and have schools that would be closer to them and perhaps more similar to them. But the court said absolutely not, that the local governments had not complied with the decision in Brown, and that it was the court's job to make them. And so they issued a writ of mandamus. You'll remember the writ of mandamus from last week. It's how we got judicial review in the first place. We had to make sure that Marbury was going to get his commission. So the courts issued that order, the writ of mandamus, saying public officials in Missouri, in Kansas City, had to do their duty. They were required to engage in this process. They could not violate the court's order. They needed to implement desegregated schools, and if it was going to be through magnet schools, then that's what it would be. There was a big dissent by Justice Kennedy, who largely disagreed with the ruling, and gradually the price tag got quite expensive for the magnet schools, and so this went back to the Supreme Court again in 1995, and the court did not reverse itself necessarily. It said that at the time Missouri had done everything it could to comply with the ruling, but that it was going to give the schools back to the hands of the local authorities. So essentially it said, okay, we appreciate that you tried. It got very expensive. It didn't work as well as we hoped. We'll sort of let you off the hook here. So this was disappointing for individuals who had been really pushing for magnet schools, and the program ended in 1999. Even though the case went back in 1995 and the program ended in 1999, the case is a really strong example of the power that the judicial system has to exert social control despite what citizens want. Overwhelmingly in Missouri and in Kansas City, citizens did not want to have integrated schools, and the courts didn't care. And that's true with the original decision in Brown v. Board of Education as well. The majority of Southern states did not want to integrate. They did not want Black students in white schools. And the judicial branch, the Supreme Court said, it doesn't matter what you want. It's in the pressing interest of justice. And so social control is one of those features that different parts of the government will enact in different ways, in whatever means they determine necessary in society to try and keep order and to maintain a society that functions as best as it can for all of the citizens. They sometimes might overstep their boundaries. They sometimes might have to be careful. And that's when we as a public have to make sure we hold them accountable. But societies that do not hold citizens to standards of decency and fairness and equality and justice are in more trouble, arguably, than societies that do. And so even though we may not like it when the government or different state agents exert power over us, they do so in a mechanism out of reciprocity, right? They're doing it so that we as citizens are protected and have rights to safety and security. It's part of that social contract. So I hope you found the material this week interesting. Next week, we're going to be moving to Chapter 10. I will be in Wisconsin starting on Wednesday. So I will have in-person office hours in my office in 7129 Social Sciences in Sewell. If you want to come visit me, I will be happy to see you. So I will be there on Thursday. If you need to make an appointment with me outside of those times, feel free. And I'm looking forward to meeting you. Bye.